I'm Sacramento County District Attorney Tin Ho. Thank you for listening to the Justice Journal podcast. This podcast series engages our community in issues that impact public safety and shares how our office is ensuring justice in the courtroom and in the community while achieving our mission of Semper Justitia, which in Latin means always just.
Welcome to the Justice Journal podcast. I'm your host, Shelley Oreo. Today's podcast is the final episode of a four-part series on topics related to driving under the influence, otherwise known as DUIs, which includes alcohol, drugs, and a mix of both. Our goal with these podcasts is to educate our community and prevent people from driving while impaired. We're ending the series with an in-depth discussion on field sobriety tests, otherwise called FSTs, and how officers detect alcohol impairment through these various tests. To help us understand the importance of SATs and identifying suspected DUI offenders, I'm joined by CHP Officer Matthew Barwoed and our lead prosecutor over DUI cases, Deputy District Attorney Danny Jensen. Can I have you both introduce yourselves, including your background and your current roles? So, Officer Barwoed, I'm going to start with you.
Good morning. My name is Officer Matt Barwood, currently employed with the CHP. I've been an officer with CHP for going on 12 years now, currently with the impaired driving section, which is stationed at CHP headquarters here in Sacramento. And my current role in the impaired driving section is I'm one of the course managers that help facilitate the DRE courses up and down the state of California.
And Danny?
Thank you. So I am Danny Jensen. I am a Deputy District Attorney with Sacramento County. I have been a prosecutor here with this county for over a decade. I have been in numerous different assignments, most recently in special victims units for several years. However, over the past 4 months, my new assignment is I am the prosecutor who is assigned to a grant position here at our office that is funded by the Office of Traffic and Safety Administration. And what I do is I specialize now in leading a team of misdemeanor trial deputies who do every misdemeanor DUI case that sets in the county of Sacramento will come through my unit, and the case will come across my desk. I read and evaluate each one of them, assess them for their strengths and weaknesses, and then assign them out to the deputies in our unit to take them to trial and to prosecute them. And then I assist and supervise and lead them to try to achieve successful prosecution on these cases.
Great. And this podcast is actually part of the grant-funded program called DUI, DUID, Misdemeanor Prosecution, Education, and Outreach. This program is funded by a grant from the California Office of Traffic Safety through the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. Officer Barwood, I'm going to start with you. Can you talk about, well, first of all, I'm going to explain DRE means Drug Recognition Expert. What kind of training is involved and how many CHP officers have this specialized training?
The training that's involved is if you're going through our academy, typical DUI detection as far as the training that's happening at our academy ranges between 60 to 80-ish hours in-house training. 24 of that is for SFST, which other agencies can get outside with the help of our unit. Upon completion of the 24-hour SFST course, hopefully officers within their first year can attend the Advanced Roadside Impaired Driving Enforcement Training, which is the 16-hour course. And then if they choose to further their DUI detection training, they can take the Drug Recognition Expert School, which is a 72-hour training somewhere up and down the state of California. I think currently we, as CHP, we have 393 current DREs. And throughout the state of California, with all agencies, we have a total of 1,356.
Okay. What does that training look like? Are they like a book type course and then also activities, or what does that look like?
Yeah, DRE is a very hands-on participation course. It is an extensive training as far as the DRE. The first 3 days entail a preschool, which is a lot of SFST history and even alcohol correlation study, uh, where they have to go back through and do their SFSTs. And then upon completion of that DRE preschool, they move on to what is called the actual DRE school, and that's when we kind of go into the 12-step process of being a DRE when we conduct evaluations, and then the 7 drug categories um, we touch a lot on.
Can you give us a little background on the FSTs? So how are they developed and how did they become a standard DUI detection tool? Is there a little bit of history that you can provide on that?
Yeah, there's a little. So with NHTSA, they contracted out with the Southern California Research Institute, or SCRI, back in the 70s, where they did these validation studies. Um, at that time, they were doing lab and field studies to show the impairment of 0.10% BAC. And that's when they kind of scientifically validated the horizontal gaze nystagmus, one leg stand, walk and turn tests. Fast forward to the 90s, we have the Colorado study, where again, they wanted to research um, the same tests in an area such as Colorado due to the mountainous terrain and all that stuff. Per se limits were also dropping at that time to 0.08, which is why we had from Colorado, we had Florida, and then the San Diego study, which is what we use to this day.
Okay. And NHTSA, for our listeners, is the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, which might come up a few times again in the podcast. When someone is pulled over, are the FSTs the same all the time, or are they modified based on what the officer sees or suspects of a driver, or is it a standard set of tests?
I would say for when it comes to DUI detection, every officer is different. Now, in a perfect world, we would love for officers to do the 3-test battery, which is horizontal gaze nystagmus, walk and turn, and one leg stand. But sometimes, given the circumstances of location and where you are, you might have to switch up your field sobriety test due to your location. Specifically for myself and some other officers, if I am suspecting drugs, I will do some other standardized field sobriety tests, such
Okay.
as finger to nose, modified Romberg, balance, and other tests.
I'm going to have you now. Can you just talk us through an initial DUI stop and what happens from there? So basically, when a CHP officer identifies a potential impaired driver, what happens at the stop from that point? I'm assuming they approach the car, and then just talk us through how it gets into administering the FSTs. And then if you can you explain how those tests detect or show impairment?
Yeah. So with DUI detection, we have what's called 3 phases. First phase is your vehicle in motion, which is our reason for contacting them. Were they speeding? Were they unable to maintain their lane? Were they doing anything out of the ordinary that maybe warranted a traffic enforcement stop or contact from us? Depending on the reason for the stop, once we do get them pulled over, that comes into our second phase of personal contact. Personal contact is everything to do with our senses. What am I seeing? What am I hearing? What am I smelling at the time of me contacting that driver? Uh, Typically, I'm looking for that strong odor of an alcoholic beverage. Typically, I might get that smell from someone that is smoking a cigarette just underneath that cigarette smell. Are there open containers in the vehicle? What indicators are they showing to me that something's out of the ordinary? Do they have bloodshot, watery eyes? Do they have slurred speech? When I'm asking for their license, registration, and proof of insurance, how are they going about finding that? Are they unable to locate that quickly? many circumstances, I've been given debit cards right off the bat.
Mm.
Obviously, we ask for your license. That's not what I'm looking for, but indicators like that kind of just seem a little off. Maybe they are nervous because maybe they've never been pulled over, but at the same time, um, there's other things we're looking for. If it's not alcohol and it's drugs, do I smell an odor of burnt cannabis? Um, do they have droopy eyelids? Are they on the nod? Stuff like that. So that's what I'm looking for. And um, going back to alcohol, if it's a car full of people, I kind of want to separate the driver from the passengers. If the passengers have been drinking, just to confirm maybe the driver hasn't been drinking at all, but at least that gets them out of the vehicle and I'm separating them from that smell.
Mm.
Um, Typically with our DUI stops, after we go through the personal contact phase, we go through our pre-arrest screening, which we might talk to them about where they were heading to tonight. We'll ask them a series of pre-field sobriety test questions, and then we'll get into our field sobriety test, depending on which ones officers choose to do. What we're really looking for is how well one can divide their attention. A lot of these field sobriety tests are of mind and body, so psychophysical, psycho mind, physical being body, and we want to see how well they can divide that attention because driving a car, as we all know, is very difficult in terms of multitasking. There's a lot of things you have to do at the time of driving to make sure you can maintain your vehicle's lane and everything else properly. SFSTs are almost the same in that nature, where we're giving a set of instructions and we want to see how well they can perform and listen to that set of instructions. And that's what we're looking for. Is there any reason for me or the officer to believe, based on the driving that we saw, is impairment due to that? Or were they just on their phone? That's for us to find out through this three phases. Um, and I can tell you right now, I think for 2023, CHP had over 58,874 DUI arrests.
Wow.
And of those arrests, that's not including other people who went through this three-phase process and weren't placed under arrest. So there's a lot of things we look for when we go through our DUI investigations, because at the end of the day, it's always the totality of the circumstances of what we have.
Mm.
And are there concerns of letting this driver down the road? There could be, but that's up to the officer at the time of their investigation.
Okay. Can you give us an example of one or two of those tests and what they show you based on how people perform?
So um, if I'm doing horizontal gaze nystagmus, I'm looking for the involuntary jerking of one's eye. There's certain things we look for. That first clue. What we're doing is we want to rule anything out medically. We want to make sure both their pupils are equal in size. We want to make sure they don't have resting nystagmus. And then we'll go into our equal tracking check to make sure that their eyes are tracking equally. If I felt I had something medical, I would call an ambulance right away to get that
So
person.
is that test when you put your finger in front of someone and you kind of track it back and forth in front of their eyes, just for our listeners, since we're not video, is that
Yeah.
what that test is, which I've seen that before.
Yeah, the horizontal gaze nystagmus, whether the officer would like to use their finger or a pen, we call it a stimulus. We'll have that stimulus approximately 12 to 15 inches, slightly elevated from the person's eyes, and we'll have them track it.
Okay.
So that first clue we're looking for is a lack of smooth pursuit in one's eyes. That typically, to me, the best way I can describe that is almost like windshield wipers being turned on a dry windshield. It's very choppy in nature, or even rolling a marble across sandpaper. It's not smooth. From lack of smooth pursuit, from lack of smooth pursuit, we'll go into distinct and sustained nystagmus at maximum deviation. We'll check that 2 times in the left and right eye, and then we'll look for an angle of onset of nystagmus prior to 45 degrees. From there, we check for vertical gaze nystagmus. Vertical gaze nystagmus in some people just might show a high dosage for that person. Um, and then we'll go into lack of convergence. Um, Lack of convergence, I should say horizontal gaze nystagmus or HGN in general does correlate with alcohol, but other drug categories such as CNS depressants, inhalants, dissociative anesthetics can be present in those drug categories. And then lack of convergence, those same three drug categories, but also cannabis can be observed if you have a lack of convergence where the eyes don't converge towards the bridge of one's nose.
Okay.
That's the test we use the most.
Do you have another example you can give us?
One of my favorite tests, it's not a scientifically validated test, but it's a standardized test, is the modified Romberg balance. That test, I'm looking for a few things. I'm looking for how well one can estimate their passage of time. And I'm looking for indicators specifically with their body, maybe muscle tone, um, stuff like that. So what I'll do is I'll set someone up to an instructed position, that being with their eyes open and their head tilted back. After that, I'll say, close your eyes, and then I'll say, begin. When I tell the person to begin, I want them to stand with their head tilted back and their eyes closed for 30 seconds. After 30 seconds has elapsed, they'll tilt their head forward, they'll open their eyes and say, stop. So I know they're done with the test.
Hmm.
Someone who has a very quick internal clock could mean a lot of things. They could be nervous, obviously, but they could potentially be under a CNS stimulant. I've had people estimate 30 seconds in 2 seconds before.
Oh my gosh.
That's a clue sometimes, but I've also had people where they go the full 90 seconds, which is what we allow. We don't let them go past 90 seconds. And they'll tell me, yeah, that was only like 15 seconds. So I'm looking for their, their muscle tone. Are they flaccid? Are they really rigid? Can I see their carotid pulsating in the neck? Are their eyelids fluttering really rapidly? Are they counting aloud? Little cues of things that I didn't say to do. Are they doing that? So again, it goes to dividing attention, but it also helps me see if it's potentially alcohol or drug related as well.
Got it. Okay. What about ones that are more cognitive that require them to process and think? Do you have any that, I mean, the counting is part of that, but do you have any that test for their ability to process information?
Yeah, I would say the walk and turn is really big with that. Um, Hopefully, I'm off the freeway when I'm administering this test, because for my safety and the person's safety, I don't want to be necessarily doing this on the side of the road. But if we're off the freeway in a parking lot in a very static environment where there's not a lot going on, it's helpful. So if I set them up to that instructed position, I'll have them imagine a straight line directly out in front of them, or I'll even use maybe a parking stall line. So I'll first have them put their left foot on that line, and then I'll tell them with the heel of the right foot to touch the toe of their left foot and keep their hands by their sides and to not move. And I want them to stay in that position until I finish my instructions. So that's the instructional stage of that test. Things we look for are, are they separating their feet? Are they starting the test too soon? So I'm looking for things like that. Things I haven't even instructed yet, but I want to see what they're doing. So once I have them set to the instructed position, I'm going to have them take 9 heel-to-toe steps out on that line. And they're going to count each step out loud. 1, 2, 3, all the way out to that ninth step. Once they reach that ninth step, they're going to leave that front foot in place. And I'm going to tell them to take a series of small steps around, taking 9 more heel-to-toe steps back from where they began the test, counting each step out loud. 1, 2, 3, and all the way out to their ninth step. And before I send them on their way, during the actual walking stage of the test, I say, there's a few things you need to remember. Make sure you're looking down at your feet. You're counting each step out loud. You keep your hands down by your sides. And then once you start the test, don't stop the test for any reason. This test has a lot of instructions, and it lets me know how well they're dividing their attention. I gave them hopefully not too complicated of a series of instructions, but I'm also explaining and demonstrating the test for them to see what I'm doing. So how are they going to put those two together when they actually get to the performance stage of this test? And again, that goes back to dividing attention and understanding if they got that information and can do that.
What are the results? How do they correlate to someone's ability to drive?
To me, it correlates to a lot of things. So divided attention is always going to be our number one thing. When it comes to driving a vehicle, there's a lot of things to do. You have to constantly check your mirrors. Maybe they're messing with the radio. Maybe they're trying to choose a song on their Amazon Music or Spotify, whatever, to get them back home. But also, when it comes to operating a vehicle, are they consistently maintaining their speed? Are they keeping their lane within, or excuse me, are they keeping their vehicle within the lane? There's a lot of things they have to multitask and do driving, as there is to doing a field sobriety test. And typically, when I come to the conclusion of my DUI investigation, I do let them know my concerns of why I think they were unsafe in operating a motor vehicle that night. But
And at that point, is then an arrest made at that point after they failed the FSTs?
well, the field sobriety tests are not meant to be pass or fail tests. I would say that's something, when I tell someone I'm placing them under arrest, that's probably the first thing that is spontaneously said is I passed all your tests. And I explain these are not tests that are pass or fail. There are things I look for in each test, as far as my explanation and demonstration of the test, like what clues or what cues are they giving me to show their attention being divided at the time of these tests. So I typically let them know my concerns of that when it comes to operating a vehicle at the time. So they aren't designed to pass or fail, but it lets us know potentially, maybe their level of sobriety in terms. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for walking us through those.
Yeah.
Danny, I want to bring you back in at this point. Can you just walk us through just the prosecution side? Can you explain the different DUI charges?
Yes, absolutely. So in a DUI prosecution, there are different species or varieties of charges that can be brought depending on the facts and circumstances of the case that we have in front of us. So this is governed under California state law and the California Vehicle Code. And essentially, there's two main divisions, and there is the one which is California law makes it unlawful to operate or drive a motor vehicle of any kind while impaired. So it is a crime in and of itself, obviously, to operate a vehicle while impaired, and it has many subspecies that I'll talk about, but also the second main separation there would be driving a vehicle while impaired and then causing injury to someone or death, right? If it results in someone's injury or death, that is a separate charge as well with different punishments. First, driving under the influence, it's broken down into a few different subsections in the law. Generally, there's a catch-all subsection, which is subsection A of 23-152 of the Vehicle Code, which basically just says it is illegal to drive while impaired under the influence of alcohol. And the reason why it's written broadly in that way is because, people do, the science and data show that people do respond to alcohol, and it does affect different people differently. So most people who've probably heard that the legal limit, for example, is having a blood alcohol concentration of 0.08% of blood alcohol in the blood. Of alcohol concentration in the blood. However, it is possible, and we do see it, where there are drivers who may not yet have that concentration, but they are nevertheless impaired. And that is evidenced by the fact that they cannot drive properly. It usually involves very poor and dangerous driving, often a collision. And then when someone like Officer Barawad comes and conducts a series of standard field sobriety tests, and you see how poorly sometimes these people perform on those tests, it makes it clear that the alcohol that they had consumed isn't impacting them in a way that is sufficient to the degree that it would be unsafe and unlawful for them to drive.
Yep.
In addition to just being impaired generally, then there are some specifics. So subsection B of that same statute says that conclusively and for everyone, regardless of their tolerance of alcohol, when they reach the concentration of blood alcohol of 0.08% or more, then they are also in violation of the law and they are DUI. And that's backed by a lot of data, science, and studies that when an individual is at a 0.08 or above, they are going to be impaired conclusively by that alcohol. It's going to react their reaction time and their ability to divide attention. So those are the most common ones, either driving under the influence or driving with a blood alcohol of above 0.08% or more. But there are others that are also specific. So subsection C refers to, it's the California law that prohibits people who are actively addicted to drugs and are not currently in treatment for their addiction. So this is a very specific section trying to target addicts who are behind the wheel. These are people who, when we say addicted, we mean someone who experiences a compulsive need to use the drug. They have developed a tolerance for the drug and they need higher and higher doses to achieve the same high or effect. And people who would suffer physical withdrawals and symptoms and would require the attention of a medical professional if they were to stop using the drug. And then we're not seeking to obviously to punish or criminalize people just for being an addict, but if they are an addict and they are out driving on the roads and they are not in current treatment, if you are currently receiving treatment for your addiction, you can't be arrested or prosecuted. But if you are essentially an unrepentant or non-contrite addict who's not even trying to get their addiction under control, then they also can be arrested and prosecuted for driving while addicted. The next subsection would be it's for people with Class A driver's licenses. So commercial drivers, truck drivers, delivery drivers, and also ride share drivers. So people who drive for Lyft and Uber. With these types of drivers, as a society, we feel that they have a higher standard of care to the rest of us, either because they are driving vehicles that are very large and could be very dangerous, or because they are a professional commercial driver who is transporting passengers as a part of their service. And so the law requires that they are not allowed to drive with a blood alcohol concentration of 0.04% or more. So the standard normal person just driving their own vehicle privately, it's 0.08%. But if you are a commercial Class A driver's license holder, or you're a ride share driver, for example, or a delivery driver, that's 0.04% or higher. And then the last two subsections are going to deal with drugs. So it is against the law to drive under the influence of drugs or the combined influence of drugs or alcohol. And they have their own charges, because sometimes, as we heard from Officer Barwed, people are driving, they are impaired, they are dangerous, but when you do all of the alcohol screening tests, the breathalyzer, it's just showing up as 000, no alcohol in their system. But the person in front of you is quite obviously intoxicated. Often they cause collisions. And so that's when someone like a drug recognition expert comes in to help evaluate that person and to get a sense for what drugs they might be under. That's later confirmed by a blood draw and an analysis of the blood.
So, Danny, as a prosecutor, how
Mhm.
important do you think the CHP DREs are and the FSTs in identifying and contributing to the prosecution of the cases?
They're indispensable. So I go around to a lot of the different county jurisdiction police agencies and I give additional training. And this is the one thing I hammer all the time is how critical it is that they ask all of the pre-field sobriety test questions and that they do. And in not every case it's possible. Sometimes it's a collision and the participants are all injured, right? And they're on a gurney or in a coma. And so there are some unique circumstances where it's not possible. Sometimes the suspect does not cooperate. They can be very hostile and uncooperative and will not perform or engage in any of these. But where possible, when we have them, they're essential. And I'll just give you a quick example for why it can be so important. It is not uncommon for people who are driving under the influence and putting citizens and themselves at risk to then try to avoid responsibility. And so one uh, common thing that we see comes from the fact of the science of how the body metabolizes alcohol. As you may know, when you consume alcohol, it's not an intravenous injection. It's being ingested down the throat and into the gastrointestinal system, which takes some time then for that alcohol to absorb through the stomach lining and intestinal lining to then make its way to the bloodstream. And that is when it begins to impair the cognitive functions of the person who drank. And so, because of that reality, we know there's some delay in the time that someone drinks to the time it's actually absorbed into the bloodstream and is affecting the person. And then from there, your liver kicks in and is doing everything it can to try to eliminate the alcohol from your system. And so it can get very complicated when the person's driving at X time, but it isn't until 3 or so hours later at the conclusion of the DUI investigation where we're finally able to have them take what is a legally admissible, accurate test of their blood alcohol concentration. The things we do on the side of the road, those little breathalyzers, are helpful. They give us data points, but unfortunately, they're not allowed to be used alone to prove someone's blood alcohol concentration. We instead have to use a much more sophisticated device that's a stationary device or draw the blood, which usually happens anywhere between 2 to 4 hours later in the investigation. And the problem with that is it, of course, allows for people later to come in and say, I was totally sober. Like, yes, when you drew my blood and when I blew into the more sophisticated machine, yes, it shows that my blood alcohol concentration was a 0.20. But the truth is I was totally sober when I was driving because I either drank a heavy amount of liquor right before driving, and so I was still sober at the time you pulled me over, or I pulled over or got in a collision, and before the cops were on scene, I just also ingested a huge amount of liquor, and that's why you're seeing the high blood alcohol concentration. Now, that might seem silly to the average listener. You'd be surprised how many jurors are convinced by that. And so that's why the field sobriety tests are so essential, because from the moment the officer sees the person, they start making observations for, are there any clinical or objective signs that to their observation makes it clear the person's intoxicated? And then if they can barely stand, if they're unable to perform these standard field sobriety tests, those are clear indicators that the person was impaired right at the time that they were driving, as opposed to making arguments later that, oh, I was sober, but when all that alcohol finally got absorbed, that's why I was a 0.20. So they're essential to the prosecution of our cases.
Danny brought up a really good point of being at collisions. I can't count how many times I've heard, I just drank all this alcohol before you guys got here, or, after the crash, whatever. But these tests are designed to help show impairment, no matter which of the 9 that we as CHP are allowed to do. It should help any officer, whether they're new, tenured, whatever. They should be able to form a good arrest decision based on the utilization of the driving observations, the questions asked on scene, and the performance of the field sobriety tests.
And if I could add something to that on when you mentioned the drugs, I believe the standard field sobriety tests become even more important in these scenarios, and they're becoming increasingly more common with the proliferation of more and more recreational drugs out on the streets, and also the abuse of prescription medications. But there have been so many studies and so much research into alcohol, and it also just chemically lends itself to being much more predictable in the human body, where it's to the point where our professionals, analysts, and scientists have done a good job at being able to predict precisely at what rate alcohol will be absorbed into the body and at what rate it will be eliminated from the body. And it's very clean and it's very crisp. With drugs, it's much more complicated. Take THC as an example. THC, marijuana, when it is smoked and inhaled into the lungs, it's almost an instantaneous entry into the bloodstream and almost immediately has an impairing effect. So what you'll see in a THC case is where someone will smoke like a joint of marijuana and the levels of THC in their blood will spike and they will spike high. And that person will be quite impaired and feeling the effects of it. However, the body does two things that are problematic. One, it can very quickly bring down very high levels of THC. Our body can just drop those levels like at a high concentration, they can drop them down to a low concentration very quickly. Meaning if someone is driving, if they smoke weed, drive, and then their blood is drawn even 2 hours later, we would expect that the THC levels have gone down significantly. But they don't go all the way to zero. Instead, then they go down to what we call like this residual range, because the body will store THC in fat and in other tissues for weeks at a time. Someone could smoke marijuana weeks ago and still have it show up in a blood test like a week or two later, especially if they were a heavy user or smoked a lot at that time. So that makes it very hard for it makes it very hard for our professionals and our analysts to be able to testify accurately as to what the person's level of impairment was just based on the chemical concentrations. It's almost impossible. So the only way, and these cases are very hard to prosecute, and the only way we're able to successfully prosecute them is when we have very bad driving, and then when we have an excellent investigation by the police where the person, through the field sobriety tests, indicated just how impaired they were at the time of drive.
What are the key takeaways that either one of you would want to have the listeners walk away with after listening to this discussion?
I think some key takeaways are these tests help show impairment. It doesn't, obviously, alcohol is the most commonly abused drug across America. It's the one everyone's most familiar with. But these do help officers make good arrest decisions out in the field, whether it be alcohol or drugs. And again, that stat of arrests that happened in 2023, I think it's good because they made good non-arrest decisions on top of the people that were actually taken into to jail for driving impaired.
I would say that it is evidence of, one, the strength and endurance of our Constitution, that we require. Officers can't just arrest people willy-nilly. They have to have what's called probable cause. They have to have some belief based in evidence that the person has committed a crime. And in this case, if that crime is DUI, what I hope people take away from this is that it's quite remarkable what they do, that there are these tests and technology that are now able to be used and employed to evaluate. And I think it cuts both ways because these tests are blind and neutral. So a breathalyzer is a machine and it has no bias. And because we're getting better all the time with being able to detect impairment. So that's what I hope people take away from this, is having a better understanding of why officers do it. It's also quite fascinating to learn about the science behind it.
Before we close, Danny, can you talk about a few other things that our office does like this in terms of DUI education and some outreach that we do in the community?
Yes. So in addition to this podcast series, our office does a number of things, including outreach to the community, which we do things like a youth academy and youth shadow days where interested youth can come and participate in programs where they shadow prosecutors or where they go to a particular presentation, like about DUIs, to learn more about it. One thing that comes to mind that we do that is directly reaching out into the community is we have received a grant from the California Highway Patrol to bring a program that's called the Real DUI Court in Schools program. And it's a program that is instrumental in educating youth about the severe legal and financial consequences of driving under the influence. And we have seen a powerful impact on the students who do participate. We just sent out an invitation to local schools, and we already have some assemblies set up in October and November to go and present, and hope to get many more throughout this grant year.
Great. And Officer Barwood, if you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I've been a part of a few of those assemblies, and it's really eye-opening to those students when they actually get to hear the sides from the DA, what we do as officers, and even the judge presiding that's there for the assembly. They ask really great questions at the end when it's time for Q&A, and I think that's a really good program for kids. I will say for the DAs and anyone else that's out there, we would love to have more of you attend our DRE schools for next year. It's good hearing not only allied agency side of things, but it's good hearing from the criminalists, the DAs, and everyone else to kind of all help us work together to help continue this program. So,
Great. Well, thank you both very much. We appreciate your insight and the information, which hopefully will help to prevent people from driving impaired. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Justice Journal podcast. You can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts, and I hope you share them with your family, friends, and colleagues.